So last week we got the chance to play a ton of Diablo IV. I covered this with a basic overview of my experience, and the general gist of my impressions were that what we played was really fun. Gameplay-wise, it felt great, the world and environments were cool, I liked the dark setting, and I had fun with the few legendary powers that I got a chance to access and play around with. So strictly speaking to the gameplay loop, the moment-to-moment action, and the overall experience of playing, it was good fun. At the same time, however, what we saw was fairly limited. It was only one of the 5 total zones in the game. We had access to 0 of the endgame systems or progression, and we only had a week to play, which in the world of ARPGs, where 1,000 hours might still get you called a casual, is not exactly a lot. So acknowledging that yes, there is still plenty to see before we drop a final verdict on the game, not least of which being how they handle the cash shop exactly. And I gotta say, I do not love the recently revealed pricing for pre-orders with $70 just getting your foot in the door, on top of the fact that this game is going to be loaded with cosmetic microtransactions, has a season pass, and they will be selling expansions. And then on top of that, they're selling early access for 4 days for an extra $20. I don't love that stuff, but I can save that discussion for another video, potentially sometime soon. If I got a busy week, but I want to talk about this for sure. But just speaking to the game itself, my early impressions are yes, Diablo IV is pretty good. So going off of that, what I've played, what I know so far, I want to talk just some more about the game. In particular, I actually want to dive a bit deeper into the open world. We touched on this in the last video, but I want to get a lot more detail focused here. This is obviously one of the biggest departures and new directions for the Diablo franchise. D4 is just a full-on open world game. It's got no loading screens between zones. There's tons of varied activities to do, and it is a shared space, putting it in line with a lot of other MMO lights akin to things like Destiny, where you will occasionally see people come in and out of your world through phasing or inside of social hubs and stuff like that. And yeah, beyond the gameplay, this aspect of Diablo IV, its open world and all of the things that contains, that is what I have enjoyed the most. So let's talk a bit more about that. So the zone that we had access to in this build was, again, one of the 5. This particular one was called Fractured Peaks. It's this like snow-swept region. There's lots of hilly terrain, some woods and rocky areas, all sorts of windy paths. As for the structure and layout, basically the open world works like this. Think lots of interconnected paths that feed into larger spaces, be those towns or settlements, castles, open fields, etc. So when you look at the map of a zone, what you will see is some spots that are more large and open, and then tons of pathways branching off in different directions, winding in and out of each other. So for example, you might have a big spot that is the location of a castle. There'll be various things to do in that castle. It'll be full of enemies. There might be some public events or even a few different dungeon entrances. All of that in just this one open spot on the map. And then coming off of that spot might be 2 or 3 exit paths sprouting in separate directions, winding around a bit, possibly connecting into other paths before they lead into another open area, another point of interest, be it a town, a field, or whatever. Now, in addition to these open areas and their connected paths, there are also these transitional spots. This kind of works like it did in Lost Ark, for example. There will be spots that you can interact with in the environment that have your character do something to move from one area to the next. Now, this includes climbing up and down a ladder or a cliffside, jumping across a gap, sliding down a ramp, shimmying across a rope, crawling through a narrow passage, things along these lines. Just little animations that your character does to move from one area to the next. It sounds like a small feature, but I really like the variety that it brings to exploring a space over just what most older ARPGs do, which have you basically just moving across a flat terrain, occasionally going up and down some stairs. But there's a lot more of a dynamic feel and a sense of verticality and depth to the world that this feature does, allowing you to move through different dimensions. I liked it in Lost Ark, and I similarly like it here in Diablo IV. Also, keep in mind, all of this overworld and everything within it, for the most part, the locations are all static. The overworld of the zones in Diablo IV, they don't change. My map will look just like your map, barring any differences in our campaign or stronghold progressions, and then any randomly popping up events like public events. So the overworld, it's various locations and windy paths. That is like the play space that you're moving throughout. But what is there to do and see? Well, for one, enemies. Of course, plenty of enemies. As you move through the world, you'll come across groups of NPCs to smash through. In this particular zone, that included a lot of skeletons, spiders, we saw Fallen and various other demons, ghosts, werewolves, and even vampires. And each of these consisting of a mix of enemy types with all of these standard ARPG classics. You'll have things like small swarms, platformers or big tanks or archers, casters and rogues, characters that explode, ones that trap you and charge you. Really, there's nothing surprising here. If you played Diablo 3, Path of Exile, Lost Ark, you know exactly what to expect in terms of the types of enemies you'll be encountering. Also in the mix are the elite variants. These will just be bigger and tougher, and of course will come with their own random affixes. Again, a lot of this falls in line with Diablo 3. They might be called different things or structured somewhat differently, but you will have wallers, you will have ones that do orbs or mortars or freeze around them. There's a ton of crossover between D3 and D4 when it comes to like the affixes that elites will have. And sometimes normal enemies will of course drop loot, but for the most part, you'll be getting a loot coming from killing elites and opening chests. And speaking of which, another Diablo classic that is returning is there's a lot of random stuff to loot and destroy in the environment. You'll find boxes, crates, barrels, wagons, furniture, logs, various things that you can just smash through. A lot of times these will be on the edge of whatever path or room that you're moving throughout. And then of course there'll be things like chests, corpses, and containers for you to loot. Basically, you click on the thing, it either opens up or explodes, and then you get something out of it some of the time. And that pretty much describes ARPGs, yeah? Okay, so that describes the play space you're moving through, some of the various things you'll be interacting with, and the enemies you'll fight. But on top of that is the layer of open world RPG with the various activities, different types of content and events. And what we're talking about here specifically are dungeons, side quests, cellars, public events, strongholds, world bosses, social hubs, collectibles, resource gathering, upgrade shrines, and so on. Let's start here by touching on the public events. These are, like they sound, gonna work similar to they do if you've ever played an MMO. This is something within the shared space of the world that you can come across and other people can join you in completing the task to get some rewards. These will always be displayed on your map as a red ring. As you're walking by them, you'll just see, hey, there's a red ring here. There's a public event going on. Let me walk towards it and discover what it is. And we saw a fair variety of different event types. Let me describe a few of them to you. There were combat altars, which are basically a horde mode. You go there, enemies spawn in, you kill them. Sometimes you'll do things like collect souls, and then at the very end, a boss will be summoned for you to take out. We also saw these things called blood altars. There were actually two variations we found, one of which you had to stand on one of 4 pressure plates surrounding an altar in the middle, and if you kill enemies while standing on the pressure plate, it'll fill it up until it's full, and then you move on to the next one. And we also saw ones that were like these 3 pillars kind of forming a triangle with a radius around them. So it's basically the same idea as the pressure plates, except instead of killing while standing on the plate, you just have to kill within the sphere of influence of each of the pillars. There were events called Raise the Effigies, where you had to destroy these bone structures that were formed up by skeleton armies while also dealing with skeletons themselves. There were crashed caravans. This is another horde mode with the twist of, hey, there are some survivors around here in these caravans, defend them from whatever's attacking. There was the Wayward Soul event, where you had to escort this ghost child around an area, bringing him to various circles as he searched for his father. There was a Liberation event. These took place in larger areas, and basically you had to move around this space, rescuing multiple captives, clearing mobs along the way, fight a boss in the middle at the end. There was the Slay the Insatiable event, where you would see this boss in this like invulnerability barrier. They would summon in all these enemies. There's a countdown timer. You just had to survive, and then also try to stop sacrifices from going to the boss. Then at the end of the timer, the barrier pops and you fight the boss. So most of these public events will have a mastery of some kind on top of that. These ranged from completing the event within a certain timer, or protecting NPCs, or even in some cases finding secret bosses hidden within the area. Whatever the mastery was, it's sort of like the bonus objective. You complete the mastery before the event ends, or whatever the restriction is, and then you get a higher tier of chest with better rewards. Now, the public events rewards from those chests include things like loot drops, of course, there will be currency, but also the real big one are the Murmuring Orbs, and this is the currency used for the gambling vendor. And the gambling vendor is just another opportunity to get more loot. It's a vendor in town. You bring Murmuring Orbs, and you're just rolling the dice every time you spend the orbs on whatever type of gear slot you're looking for. Locations of these public events did seem to be static, as in there will always be a public event happening within a certain spot. However, it does seem like the event itself can change. So for example, I came across this area that was a raised platform, and the first time I went there, I had to protect this person who was under attack from hordes of skeletons coming from all directions. But the second time I went there, it was a different event in which I had to destroy skeletal altars and then fight a boss at the end. Now, I'm not sure, and I touched on this in the last video, I'm not sure if every event will always be different within these static spots. I think it's much more so the case that some spots will have rotating events, some spots spots will always have specific events. That appears to be how they work. The next open world activity that I want to touch on, and one of my favorite things in this game and in RPGs in general, are the dungeons. I quite like these. Dungeon diving, just one of my favorite experience in these types of games, and that remains true in Diablo 4 as well. They have said that the game will have over 100 dungeons at release. Now, the one zone that we had access to in this preview build had 23 of them alone, so quite a lot scattered all throughout the zone in various regions, much of which were actually a bit off the beaten path. You actually have to go searching for them, clearing the fog on the map to reveal their locations. It's just, there were a lot. I was constantly discovering new ones in the entire time of us playing through this preview, so pretty cool. So the overworld, like I mentioned, has a static layout. That includes the entrance locations of those dungeons, but the inside of the dungeons themselves, those are procedural. I saw a fair variety of visual appearances for these. They didn't all feel samey, really, in presentation. Many of them were quite unique, in fact, and I'm not just talking about their unique procedural layouts, but just these dungeons, they felt like particular places, and each dungeon, for the most part, felt different from the other dungeons. There was, of course, some crossover. We have some standard dungeons that are like dark catacombs or cellars that are lit with torches and candles and full of skeletons, but then there were some really unique locations. For example, a few different ice caves, old mines, and snowy forests. We found a vampire stronghold, which was like in this gothic castle, these old ruins that were overrun by werewolves, these demon-infested villages, hellscapes with gore and creepy tendrils everywhere. These appear to be one of the early layers of the underworld. There was a dungeon that started off on the cliff's edge of a mountain and then led into this castle that seemed to go underground. There were these magic-infused archives, all sorts of different variety, and yes, not just talking about the fact that the layouts are procedural and that giving a uniqueness, but they didn't feel too repetitive. Using some of the same types of settings, absolutely that is happening, but I think what I'm actually most excited about is the notion that the other zones, given that they are basically in different types of biomes, I'm expecting to see more additional variety in those dungeons as well, beyond the 23 examples that we saw in this build that we got a chance to play. The dungeons varied in size and duration to complete, and then obviously you can take your time or sprint through them, which will make them shorter or faster. There was a variance in complexity and size and number of levels. One of the biggest, most complex ones that we stumbled across was sort of actually hidden off the edge of the map away from everything else. And it was this 3-tier dungeon that started out as what I would describe an ice castle and then progressed into catacombs, going deeper and deeper until they eventually ended in a fight with a boss. So the first floor was pretty simple. It was filled with these various dead-end rooms. We had to search for these blood gems inside of them. And then once we picked one up, it would spawn a lot of mobs as well as a mini boss. And then after finding all 3 of them, we would place them at the door to the next level, which dispelled a barrier letting us through. In floor 2, this was even bigger than the first floor. It required us to kill enough of these reverent enemies and mini bosses to fill up this altar with souls, and then that gave us access to the 3rd floor. And then floor 3 was even bigger still and required us to collect boxes to put them in this pedestal in the boss room. Upon doing so, an animation played, the boss pops out. It was this necromancer boss, which probably actually was like the 5th or 6th time we had fought the boss. One of my critiques right now is that how many boss types get reused in these dungeons, but nevertheless, after that long extended dungeon, we get to the boss, we fight the boss, and that completes it. Dungeons will have things like dungeon-specific events. These are kind of similar to the open world public events, except just inside of the dungeon, but they work much in the same way. They've got an overlapping structure. Sometimes these will even be tied into dungeon progression. So like there was this demonic corrupted thing with this huge totem and horde mode that opened up the room to the boss that we had to do, or there was one where we had to kill all of the enemies in a single room in order to dispel a barrier to move on to the next area. Also inside of the dungeons are dungeon shrines. These are very similar to how they are in Diablo 3. You click on the shrine, you get a buff. Buffs will include things like dropping more gold from enemies, endless ability usage, guaranteeing critical strike or unlimited resource, invulnerability shrines, blast rave shrines, all sorts of different shrines. There were some mixing up in there as well, like with curse shrines, where you'd click a shrine to get a buff, but then a horde of enemies would attack that you'd have to kill before you get the buff, or the crack shrines, which would be split up and you had to find the top half, put it on, and then you could collect the buff. Both of which just added a bit more variation to the engaging with shrine encounters. Now, as I mentioned, dungeon locations are static. The layouts inside are procedural. These will change up every time they reset, and I do believe that resetting requires a relogging, just like it does in Diablo 3, or just moving into a different instance, which could mean joining up with another player who's grouped up and has their own instance where they haven't cleared a dungeon. But yeah, dungeon layouts are procedural. They will reset every time you reset your world state, essentially. And why are you doing dungeons besides the fact that, hey, it's a fun thing to do? And of course, you're getting loot, you're going there, the elites that you kill will drop loot, chests will drop loot, the bosses will drop loot, but also completing dungeons is how you unlock, it's the main way you get these aspects, which are unlocked in your Codex of Power, and these are legendary powers that once you unlock one, you can then enhance your gear with, changing it from a rare to a legendary and giving you that legendary effect. And that's a huge motivating factor to going out and finding and completing dungeons, is to unlock these legendary powers and put it on your gear and play around with these different versions of builds. You're still looking for legendary drops. I have been told that legendary drops can have more powerful versions of these legendary powers, the aspect system, but nevertheless, you can just guarantee to try out some variation of legendary powers just by completing the dungeon the very first time, which was pretty cool. I enjoyed it. That had me seeking out dungeons to unlock these new powers and put it on my gear to try it out. I really enjoyed that whole process. And yes, generally, I really like the dungeons. It was a great experience. My biggest critique for sure is the fact that the dungeon bosses seem to repeat so often. Now let's go ahead and move on to the Stronghold system. These are set locations within the game world that are kind of more elaborate versions of events. You play through them and they unlock new stuff. So you'll go to a place, it'll be in some state. Normally things aren't good, and then you help out, you clear the enemies, and the things change. It can change into a town, an event hub, a dungeon location, and sometimes a combination of these things. So within the Fractured Peaks zone, there were 3 strongholds to engage with. First, there was Nostrava Stronghold. This is what I would describe as a deserted town. You come across it, it looks like nothing's going on, but then you explore and you find inside of the town's church are a bunch of people worshiping Lilith. The whole church erupts in flames, you fight them back, and then you go back throughout the town, you cleanse out the homes, you go back to the church, you fight a boss. This was actually kind of a tough boss fight. It like split into 3 variations of itself. And clearing this stronghold then unlocked a town with a waypoint, a few vendors, and it also unlocked a brand new dungeon. The second stronghold, Malnock, was like, it took place on this icy mountaintop area, which led into the front of a castle. We were tasked with killing these 3 frozen priests. Then after that, we had to fight this boss, the Frosthorn Ice Clan champion. This was a very tough boss fight as well. And then once this was cleared, it unlocked a small town with some basic vendors and the entrance to 3 different dungeon locations. And then there was a third stronghold as well. I'll keep that one a little bit of a surprise for you. Now, and I'm being pretty quick about going through these and describing what we did, but it's kind of like an event, like a public event, except it's in a static area. It is this very specific thing, and it's a bit more drawn out. I very much so simplified it. It's a bit more drawn out than any old public event. And yes, it changes the world state for you. And I should mention as well, these will be tied to individual characters' progression. It's not like someone else can clear a stronghold and it'll be cleared for you. The strongholds are only cleared when you clear it. And then at that point, you will be in a world with other people who have also cleared the stronghold as well. It's just basic phasing tech that they're using that we've seen in a lot of games nowadays. And it's a pretty cool system. I like it. Another big thing to do within the open world is fight the world boss. There was one in the version of the game we played. He was located on the far eastern side of the zone. His name was Ashava the Pestilent. Anytime prior to him summoning, there would be like a 5-minute timer. So that tells everyone on your server, boss is coming, head on over to that location. And then he comes up, he's a big old bird creature with a beak and lots of long spikes, these huge talons. He had a few different cool abilities, like he could jam his talons into the ground and then swoop around in a big arc. If you tried to get close, sometimes he would leap away, forcing you to run towards him, but then you might potentially get hit with his talon swipe. Or once you did get close, he had a lunge where he would snap with his beak. He had this smash down, which he would damage an area directly underneath him. And as you probably expect, it's a phased boss and things get more difficult and he gets new mechanics the further and more health segments you work down. Now, when we fought him, there weren't a lot of people on. This preview build in general didn't have a lot of people, so we didn't actually get to fully finish the boss fight. I can't tell you about all of the mechanics, but yeah, it was pretty interesting, and I really like the sense of scale they give to the boss simply by taking what is your traditional top-down ARPG camera perspective at a set distance and zooming it way back. That was actually something they did a ton in Lost Ark as well, and I really liked it, and I'm glad they're doing it in D4. Being willing to occasionally change the location of the camera and even the angle of the camera in certain circumstances, it just makes the world feel more immersive. It puts you more in the play space. Okay, now let's talk about the social hubs. So Diablo 4 has towns. This is where where you will go to interact with vendors, pick up quests, repair and sell items, engage with the various systems that are associated with NPCs. But yeah, the towns are also social hubs because this is a shared world game. Here you are going to see other players running around. I found for the most part, this is the highest density of players you will ever see, with the exception of being the boss fights. But you'll see people running around, you'll get to see their gear, you can chat with them, emote them, challenge them to duels, and group up with them as well. The major town within Fractured Peaks was called Kiovashad, and this is where you would find every useful NPC and vendor type in the game. Basically exactly how towns in Diablo 3 would work, but a little more spread out, actually a lot more spread out. D3 towns were fairly consolidated. This first town, Kiovashad, was pretty, you'd have to walk a bit to get to the different vendors. And it seems like the general structure is every zone will have one major town that has every vendor and every sort of interactable relevant NPC. And then throughout the zone, there will be smaller towns that have vendors. Some of them will also have waypoints as well. And yeah, one major town, a few smaller towns. All towns, from what I know, are social hubs as well. A couple more things out in the open world that I just want to quickly touch on. First are the collectibles. These include the Altar of Lilith, which are this permanent account-wide stat boost for all of your characters. So these will reward things like bonus health, strength, and intelligence, and dexterity. And they were very well hidden. And in the entire time that we played, we actually only found 4 out of the 28 potential altars of Lilith within the Fractured Peaks. Couldn't really exactly see them very quickly. Now, we weren't actively searching for them either, but whenever we noticed one, we would certainly grab it. It just seems like they are hidden just enough that if you are doing the typical ARPG sprinting through an area, you are bound to miss a lot of them. So keep an eye out for these. And then with Diablo 4's crafting systems that play into those various vendors, there is harvesting as well. All throughout the play space, you will find various types of herbs and minerals that you can collect, and these are used for crafting within the artisans. Some other noteworthy stuff in the open world include the cellars. Now, the game's tutorial described these as small instances that may contain a wide range of content. In our experience, they were not very wide-ranging. Every single cellar we came across was an entrance and then a single room that would have a few enemies within it, as well as a mini-boss. Every single cellar was exactly like that. So it's fine. It's just small form content. I just thought it was funny that it said that cellars could be a wide range of content. Maybe outside of the Fractured Peaks, that's the case, but within, it's just always one room that has some enemies in it, and that's it, literally every cellar. And then also were these open world shrines. So think similar to the shrines within dungeons, but requiring an extra step, and that is having to emote. You will walk up to these statues. It's gonna have some kind of cryptic message on a faded plaque. You decipher what that is, which basically is which emote do you use. You use the emote, you get a buff. This can be increased movement speed, invisibility, getting a follower for a little while. Those are all the ones we found. I am presuming there are more on top of that as well. And then all of these systems, all of this stuff also plays into the region progress account progression. Everything that you do, doing quests, discovering locations, or engaging in any of these activities will earn you renown, and then that unlocks various rewards. This basically acts as a tracker to make sure that you've done every major activity in every zone. So for example, the Fractured Peaks had 7 waypoints, 3 strongholds, 24 side quests, 83 areas to discover, 23 dungeons, and 28 altars of Lilith. And then unlocking every single tier would give your character some experience and currency, but then it would also unlock something for your entire account. So the first tier would give 1 skill point, the second tier gave a potion charge, tiers 3 and 4 gave additional skill points, and tier 5 would give 4 paragon points. So this region progress thing, it keeps track of the different things to do and also gives you account progression, is the simple way to consider it. And then finally, obviously, also playing within the open world space are all the endgame systems. Now, the build that we played didn't have them, but we do know that when Diablo 4 launches, this is going to include Nightmare dungeons, which are just harder versions of the existing dungeons. Hell Tides, which are just event-wide activities where an entire zone will change. Everything within it will become more difficult, and they've got special currencies and rewards from that. The Fields of Hatred will be these static zones that are dedicated to PvP, and then the Tree of Whispers are more or less your daily quests, just rotating bounties that you're able to do. So as far as I'm aware, that is the full list. That is an exhaustive list covering just about every type of thing there is to do and see within the open world of Diablo 4, based off of what we saw, that one zone we had access to. Which brings me to the next point. I get the sense that this map is pretty big. Once more, we were playing on one of the 5 zones that the game are going to launch with, and if we're we're talking being a completionist, there was quite a lot to do and see within this zone. Even after the 50 hours of playtime, there were still things that we hadn't fully unlocked and fully discovered, and it is one of 5 zones. Now, we haven't seen a full official map with the breakdown of each zones and like their square footage. Blizzard has given us a tease with some early reveals of the map at BlizzCon, and then we have seen a few fan interpretations of this, and based on that fan interpretation map that we saw, this looks actually fairly accurate to what the Fractured Peaks ended up actually being. And if we translate the size of the Fractured Peaks, it actually looks like it might be one of the smaller zones of the 5 total zones that the game is launching with, and that is just launching with, because the entire world of the map of Sanctuary that Blizzard has revealed shows quite a lot of unfulfilled space, and we presume if Diablo 4 is successful, if they're making enough money from the game and from all of the microtransactions and the cash shop and the battle pass and the expansions that they're selling, it is safe to presume that if this game's lifespan continues and Blizzard really fully supports it, we are actually haven't even seen half of what will fully be here when all is said and done and the entire thing is complete. That's making a lot of assumptions that they are going to fill the entire world of Sanctuary within Diablo 4, and they're going to support it for that long, but presuming they do, it looks like there's a lot more of the game to come, and there already seems to be a lot there at the get-go. But again, keep in mind, I just played a preview. I only got a week to play it. There's still a lot more time that needs to be sunk into this game, and there's still a lot that I haven't seen, and a lot of things that we just simply won't know until release. Speaking of which, the release date was recently officially revealed. This had been leaked earlier in the week, but now we know for certain that Diablo 4 will be releasing on June 6, 2023. The pre-orders are already live, and oh boy, Standard Edition is $70. I know that the industry is moving towards this pricing for full AAA games, but I hate to see a $70 price tag on a game with a cosmetic shop, with the season pass, and that will also be selling expansions. I'm not surprised, but I am disappointed that the entry level for this game is $70, considering all that other monetization they're going to be doing. I mean, they're doing like free-to-play levels of monetization and also charging $70. Again, at this point, not exactly surprised, but I was hoping they would have gone a little bit lower, as naive as that may sound. And I may make a whole video talking a bit more now that the monetization has been nailed down about all of that, including the $90 4-day head start. This was teased, this was hinted at basically in those Diablo 4 bundle surveys that Blizzard sent out a few months back, but now that we know it's actually happening, I don't love the 4-day head start. Yeah, sure, we can argue that it like takes some pressure off of the servers, but you know, anyone who wants to play on launch with their friends, if any of their friends buy the head start, there's going to be that FOMO pushing towards it. Now, do we blame Blizzard for FOMO that people have? People can control themselves, right? These practices, a lot of these monetization practices, these companies do it on purpose. It isn't out of the goodness of their own heart, because yeah, they're a business and they're trying to make money, and they know that a lot of people want to play as soon as it's available. And so the idea that comes with a $90 price tag, again, on a game that has a cash shop, a season pass for sale, and is going to be selling expansions, it just feels like a bridge a little too far. And I say all of this acknowledging that playing D4 as a game, it's a fun game. I like it as a game. It was fun. I had fun playing. I'm looking forward to playing again. But I think we need to bear in mind, you can look forward to a game, you can be excited and interested in a game and wanting to play a game and planning to play a game while still criticizing parts about it that you don't like. And yes, I don't love how far-reaching they are going with Diablo 4's pricing. They can support the lifetime of Diablo 4 without charging $90 for a 4-day head start, right? I think they can. That's what I'm saying. I'm not a business major, but I think they can. But that does it for me today. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video detailing a more detailed version of discussion for the open world. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.